Grand Admiral Karl Doenitz was a hardcore Nazi commander and head of the German Navy during World War II. He reported to and succeeded Adolf Hitler and was a cornerstone of the Nazi High Command, sitting alongside the likes of Hermann Göring, Joseph Goebbels, and Heinrich Himmler. His cold and heartless command of Germany's forces between 1939 and 1945 resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, saw him brought to justice at the Nuremberg trials, and earned him his place as an architect of darkness.
It's an often overlooked part of the history of the Second World War that in the Nazi era there was actually more than one Führer. When Adolf Hitler took suicide at the end of April 1945, there was a successor. That successor was Admiral Karl Doenitz. Doenitz was actually the second Führer in that respect.
Karl Doenitz was born in 1891 in Grunau, in the former Berlin borough of Köpenick near Berlin. He was the son of an engineer, Emil Doenitz, and younger brother to Friedrich. At the age of 19, he enlisted in the Kaiserliche Marine, the Imperial Navy as it was then, in 1910. When World War I began in 1914, he served on the light cruiser SMS Breslau, operating out of Constantinople, engaging Russian forces in the Black Sea. In 1916, Doenitz was promoted to Oberleutnant zur See, at which time he requested a transfer to the submarine forces and attended the Submariners School at Flensburg-Mürwik. He served as a U-boat officer for much of the last year of the Great War.
Doenitz himself was an inconspicuous figure. He was a dedicated naval officer who had a good record in the Great War. He had lost his own submarine in the Mediterranean when it developed technical troubles and he had to scuttle the ship. But he was nonetheless seen as a good and worthy officer.
As commander of UB-68, operating in the Mediterranean, he was captured by the British and incarcerated in the Redmeyers camp near Sheffield. He remained a prisoner of war until 1919. On 10th of January 1921, in the new German Navy, the Reichsmarine, he rose through the ranks quickly, becoming a lieutenant commander on torpedo boats. Then, in 1934, he was put in command of the training cruiser Emden. In that year, Doenitz took an oath to his new Führer that would later incriminate him beyond doubt as a perpetrator of crimes against humanity. This is the oath he took.
I swear by God this holy oath, that I will render to Adolf Hitler, Führer of the German Reich and people, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, unconditional obedience, and that I am ready, as a brave soldier, to risk my life at any time for this oath.
Up until this time, Germany had been prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles from possessing a submarine fleet, and in 1935, when the Reichsmarine was renamed the Kriegsmarine, all that changed.
Once Hitler had renounced the Treaty of Versailles on the 16th of March 1935, it took a mere 3.5 months for the first German U-boat to be launched from the shipyards in Kiel in northern Germany.
There was a naval arms race, of course, where we saw famous battleships like the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst being launched. at the same time, the shipyards at Kiel and places like that were turning out the U-boats as fast as they possibly could.
In 1935, Karl Doenitz, an experienced U-boat commander in World War I, was appointed to take charge of the resurgent U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine. He had spent the interwar years designing the best method of attack with torpedoes. By 1929, he had already refined the tactics that would later bring such success to the U-boats. This was the Wolfpack theory. General Admiral Erich Raeder had been appointed as admiral in charge of the Reichsmarine during the years of the Weimar Republic between the wars. He disliked the Nazi Party, but continued to command the navy, now known as the Kriegsmarine, and Hitler promoted him to Grand Admiral in 1939. It was Raeder who suggested the invasions of Denmark and Norway in order to secure docks out of reach of the Royal Navy and Air Force. Doenitz was informed of the impending war on August 15, 1939. By then, he had 46 U-boats at his disposal, and he ordered them all out to sea to avoid their being trapped in docks by an anticipated British sea blockade. They were sent to take up pre-arranged positions to attack British shipping wherever it might be encountered, from the Mediterranean to the English Channel and the North Sea.
Kriegsmarine were there at the very start of the war when the battleship Schleswig-Holstein fired upon the city which is now Danzig.
Auch das Schulschiff Schleswig-Holstein nimmt die Westerplatte unter Feuer.
So right from the outset of World War II, the Kriegsmarine played a huge role in bringing about World War II and persecuting World War II.
I was on the U-boats when the war started, and I was still with them at the end. We were already in the Atlantic when the war broke out, to the west of Ireland. A radio message came through, which I can remember said that hostilities against England had been opened. No one shouted hooray. We mumbled, if that's the way it has happened, then roll up your sleeves. We certainly weren't very happy about it. England was a hard adversary, we knew that, a difficult adversary on the sea.
Our only goal was survival. There was nothing else. It was either the enemy at the time, let's say, or us. Everyone used to say that men in the Navy were very brave men. We didn't have any other choice. I was 21 years old. I couldn't stick my head in the sand or give up and crawl back. That wasn't possible. If one went, we all went.
On the 3rd of September 1939, the liner Athenia was sunk. War had only been declared a few hours earlier, so when Oberleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp fired 2 torpedoes into her, she was the first British vessel to be sunk in the war. Against the accepted prize rules of war, Lemp had given no warning, as he had considered the ship to be an armed auxiliary cruiser. 112 crew members and passengers were killed, mainly through inept rescue attempts. As 28 US citizens were among the dead, Hitler ordered the logbook for U-30 to be altered, and the crew were forbidden to speak of the incident. Goebbels promptly accused the British of sinking the liner, in order to provoke the Americans into joining the war, something Hitler wished to avoid at all costs. There was no American intervention after the Athenia sinking, and the U-boats wasted no time in showing the potential they possessed for winning the war. Lemp, in the U-30, this is the U-boat emblem showing his dog Schnurzel, who was later drowned at sea with a sinking destroyer, sank another 2 ships before the month was over. By the time he returned to the docks in Wilhelmshaven on the 27th of September, with 1 engine out of service, 39 British ships had been sunk, a total of 150,000 tons. Only 2 U-boats, U-27 and U-39, had not returned home. The happy time for the U-boats had begun, and the British Admiralty was in a state of alarm.
We searched any merchant ships we found to find out if the ship was carrying materials that could be used in the war. And if there weren't any, then it was made to sail into Kiel, and the men were tried before a court. That's what happened at the beginning of the war. Later, many merchant ships were armed. The hatches went down and the guns came out. After that, we were instructed to fight total war. All foreign ships were to be torpedoed.
This was a radical departure from the accepted rules of warfare, in which civilian ships would be sunk without any warning. As a result, the U-boat war was a particularly nasty campaign.
Doenitz's reward was to be made an admiral on the 1st of October, and he was now officially Commander-in-Chief of submarines. But there were awards at the dockside for many of the submariners. Decorations were handed out after the men had completed a second operational trip against the enemy. In all, 125 submariners were awarded the Knight's Cross, and 29 received oak leaves to their crosses. 5 had the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. By the end of 1940, the British Navy was being seriously challenged by a relatively small fleet of German U-boats. The sonar submarine locating device, the ASDIC, had not proved itself to be as effective as the Navy had hoped. And there was another problem. The German radio interception service, the B-Dienst, had been able to monitor British naval radio traffic and thus pinpoint the locations of convoys. These were then passed on to Doenitz, and the submarine attacks coordinated and directed to possible targets. Success gave Doenitz the confidence to predict that the U-boats could isolate Britain and remove her as a threat to German expansionism.
But at the beginning of the war, the enemy boats, the convoys, were controlled by our boarding parties. Boats would be put down on the water, and we sailed over to them. The crew were allowed to leave in their lifeboats. They were supplied with provisions. Only after that had happened would the boat or ship be sunk. In the later years of the war, survivors, men swimming in the water, would be shot at.
He siphoned off 20 boats from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, where the Italians in Africa were in need of assistance, and Rommel's Africa Corps was being reinforced by sea. In June, when Operation Barbarossa was unleashed on Russia, a further 6 boats were sent north to prowl the waters around the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. At one stage, there were only 4 boats left in the Atlantic. There was no respite for the British. By September, another 164 ships had gone down, and at the year's end, over 2 million tons of shipping had been sunk. By June 1941, the German rhetoric had turned against Russia. There was no more talk of the German-Russian Pact of 1939, of friendship. The U-boats were sent northwards to operate in some of the most treacherous waters in the world. British convoys operating out of Iceland, which the Americans had occupied on July the 7th, 1941 to use for bases, had to sail up to 2,000 miles to bring the first assignment of Hurricane fighter planes to the Russians.
The U-boat war took place not just in the North Atlantic, where it's famous, but also right round into the Arctic Circle, where Britain was trying to keep Soviet Russia supplied and in the war with tanks and aircraft which had to be ferried up round the northern tip of Norway.
Doenitz was infuriated that Iceland was in US hands and proposed that the U-boats be used to counteract the effect of the occupation. Hitler, still not wishing to provoke the Americans, refused to sanction such a move, and the effectiveness of U-boats in the area was further diminished. In August 1941, Hitler ordered the U-boats into the Mediterranean. Hitler wanted the British warships and supply ships to be targeted. One of the U-boats sent to the Mediterranean from September of 1941 was U-81, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Guggenberger. On his first tour of duty, Guggenberger was responsible for the sinking of the HMS Ark Royal and was awarded the Bravery Medal in bronze and then later in silver by the Italian government. Doenitz felt that he would be able to deal with the inexperienced US Navy if he could strike quickly. Admiral King of the United States Navy was slow to react. He disliked the English and chose to ignore the information he received from the British Admiralty. Doenitz instigated Operation Drumbeat and briefed the U-boat commanders on December the 17th. Despite attempts by Doenitz to deceive the Allies into believing that boats were concentrating in the northwest Atlantic approaches, the British Admiralty Tracking Room was by now wise to his ways and, on January the 2nd, 1942, warned that 5 or 6 U-boats were heading towards America. The first U-boat, U-125, was sent into Canadian waters. It was a difficult journey. The weather was extremely rough, forcing several boats to stay submerged for long periods, surfacing only to recharge batteries and ventilate. The first U-boats arrived off the eastern seaboard of the United States on January the 12th. Before 3 days had passed, U-123 alone had sunk 3 ships. The second happy time for the U-boats was underway. It was time for reporters of Signal to gloat again. The U-boats were not confined to the waters around North America. They extended their hunting grounds to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, where 77 ships were sent to the bottom in May alone. Admiral King had finally relented on the wisdom of using the convoy system, and from the beginning of May, the first convoys were starting out into the oceans. Although this marked the end of the happy time, it was by no means the end of the killing. With the increased strength of defences on the eastern seaboard of America, Doenitz once more turned his attention to the North Atlantic. As the year drew to a close, Doenitz's fleet comprised of 393 U-boats, of which 212 were operational. The Germans began to work on their own radar systems and upgraded both their deck guns and torpedoes, which now had greater striking power. The battle for the Atlantic was far from over. Although both Hitler and the German High Command had consistently thwarted Doenitz, he was undaunted, and his faith in his crews remained strong. The U-boats had done well. In July, they had sunk 143 ships, and in November, 117. The successes were obviously continuing, yet 3,221 men had lost their lives. And ominously, as the year progressed, so did the number of boats lost. In October, 16 boats did not return. By 1943, Allied aircraft were covering the entire Atlantic battleground. The fighters from the American carriers Santee, Bogue and Corps sank 6 U-boats in July of that year. Liberators and British Sunderlands, equipped with long-range fuel tanks, patrolled continually. With electronic surveillance becoming ever more sophisticated, the boats were now in constant danger. The Enigma code-breaking equipment was in Allied hands, so they could decipher U-boat traffic without German knowledge. And as Doenitz insisted that all communications to and from the U-boats passed through his office, he unwittingly endangered his crews even more. In July 1942, with the effectiveness of the American defences increasing, Doenitz had made a broadcast to the German people to prepare them for what lay ahead. And his message was grim. There were harsh realities to submarine warfare, he said. Losses amongst the U-boats would increase, and the situation would get worse. As the British Admiralty was also monitoring radio broadcasts, they concluded that the boats would soon be back patrolling the main convoy routes around Britain with increased intensity. They were right. The men were aware of the destruction they had caused, of other men drowning in the icy water, and of their own probable fate in the not-too-distant future. By 1943, the crews were being replenished with young boys as young as 17 or 18. Their training times had been reduced, and their inexperience resulted in even more deaths through accidents. One submariner reported that on his boat, only 4 of the crew had any experience of submarine warfare at all, a situation that got steadily worse.
Doenitz, of course, was one of the major war criminals who was tried at Nuremberg for his role in the events of the Second World War. He was responsible for the whole of the Kriegsmarine and therefore took responsibility not just for the surface ships but also for the unrestricted submarine warfare that was carried out by Raeder and his U-boats.
In 1943, the U-boats were still a constant cause of concern to the Allies, and the first engagements of the year did nothing to dispel their fears that the U-boat threat was in no way diminished. U-boats began the year by sinking 7 tankers without the loss of a single boat. There were now 222 boats operational, out of a total of 409, of which 178 were assigned to the Atlantic. Back in Washington, Allied military staffs agreed to coordinate their attacks more coherently. Their deliberations produced the creation of the US 10th Fleet to act as a unified command control for all Western Atlantic anti-submarine operations. The fate of the U-boats was clear, as the full might of Allied military power was directed onto them.
The U-boat wasn't really the underwater craft that people imagine. The U-boat was essentially a surface craft which could submerge for a period of time. And that was, of course, their Achilles heel because they were easy to spot on the surface and it took time to dive and an aircraft would know where the U-boats were. Nonetheless, the U-boat fleets almost brought Britain to its knees by sinking merchant ships.
(1943) was a year of great change for the U-boats. Hitler was unhappy with the failures of the German surface fleet and threatened to throw the complete fleet of surface ships into the dustbin. The arguments continued until an exasperated Raeder finally resigned on the 30th of January. The new commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine was Karl Doenitz, now promoted to Großadmiral. His chief of staff, Konteradmiral Eberhard Gott, was given responsibility for running U-boat combat operations. Doenitz still kept a close watch on U-boat activities, however, and his replacement officers were trusted associates. Doenitz was to feel the loss of U-boat crews even more keenly as he began his new role. Both his sons, Peter and Klaus, were lost at sea on U-boats, Peter in 1943 and Klaus the following year.
It's estimated that something like 750 U-boats were destroyed, and they lost something like 70,000 submariners. Doenitz himself lost sons in the war, so it was a tragedy for the world, and it was no surprise that Doenitz was taken to Nuremberg to stand trial as one of the major war criminals.
Doenitz, of course, was more aggressive in his advocacy of U-boat warfare than Raeder had been. On January the 30th, he gave the order that all submarines were to attack commercial shipping, whether they were neutral or hostile. He had already issued the Laconia order the year before, which prohibited any submariners from going to the aid of the survivors of stricken vessels, as such actions increased the danger that his own boats would be attacked. The volunteers on the manned torpedoes had a 50-50 chance of survival, but the torpedoes were cheap and also easily mass-produced. The men were called Opferkämpfer, which literally translated means sacrifice fighters. The torpedoes in various versions were used until the end of the war. Albert Speer was one of Hitler's most loyal servants. He had become Minister of Arms and Munitions when Fritz Todt was killed in February of 1942. His impressive record of increased productivity despite the devastating Allied bombing campaign was due to the use of slave labour, to which some 7.5 million foreigners were subjected by 1944. U-boat production also benefited from slave labour, which Doenitz sanctioned in order to achieve his ultimate aim, the subjugation of England. The newsreels tried to put a positive gloss on the fact that young men were slowly replacing the experienced crews of the submarines. They did not, of course, mention what detrimental effect inexperience was having on the U-boat's war effort. It was not unknown for boats to be torpedoed by their comrades. Although 57 ships were lost to U-boats in the Indian Ocean, the Allies could easily replace these. It was the Atlantic that was the vital battleground, and it was there that the war would be won or lost.
It's all right for a while, but eventually that way of life just made you sick. But morale was high, all thanks to Doenitz. We thought a lot of Doenitz. Only, later on, I couldn't understand why the boats were being sent out, even though Doenitz knew that they wouldn't return to the base.
Wolfgang Lüth, commander of 4 boats, the last of which was U-181, did return to base from all of his missions. He was one of the most successful and outstanding commanders of the war, and in terms of tonnage sunk, came second only to Otto Kretschmer with a total of 226,000 tons. He was also one of the most highly decorated men, and was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds. He had also been designated to become successor to Doenitz. Lüth was killed accidentally just days after the war ended, when a sentry fired at him after he had failed to identify himself. In Germany, whatever the reality on and under the oceans, the reports were always of magnificent successes. To console the English about the spectacular German U-boat successes against the deliveries to the British Isles, Winston Churchill said that there was a lack of recruits for the German U-boats. We can reassure him that for every U-boat that it is possible for our expanding force to build, there are enough volunteers ready and willing, and Mr. Churchill can rely on the fact that they are as highly trained as possible. It will be decided in the schools who has the ability to join the U-boats and serve on the front line in the oceans and along the English coast, and so help to bring about German victory over England. Whilst the periodicals kept most of the German population in the dark about the true situation with the U-boats on the seas, the families of the submariners knew the reality. But with the increasingly depressing news from Russia and elsewhere, any success was welcome and eagerly filmed for the newsreels. Here, Wolfgang Lüth is visiting his hometown in northern Germany. The relatives of the sailors, however, knew that it was becoming rare for the U-boats to return home after a second operation. Under-strength crews were now manned by men of 20 years of age and even teenagers. The chance of these men surviving even their maiden voyage was almost nil.
We didn't know a lot about what was going on. Yes, we knew that Herr Prien, who had been hailed as a hero after Scapa Flow, we knew that he had been killed. But otherwise, I really only learned after the war that 33,000 U-boat men, just U-boat men, that is, didn't return home.
So Kriegsmarine under Doenitz were fighting on every possible front. They were in the Mediterranean, they were in the North Atlantic, and of course they were in the Arctic. Stretching down to South America, we had the Battle of the River Plate, where the famous battleship Graf Spee met its end. So this was very much a worldwide conflict with the Kriegsmarine roaming the high seas, looking to destroy Allied shipping wherever they could.
Grand Admiral Erich Raeder resigned in January 1943, finally unable to cope with an increasingly unpredictable Hitler. Karl Doenitz was appointed Grand Admiral in his place in charge of the Kriegsmarine. In 1944, Germany was being assaulted on 3 fronts, and to the German High Command, an invasion of the European mainland seemed increasingly likely. Doenitz knew that the submarines could make a vital contribution. The only problem was that no one knew where or when the invasion was going to come, which made it impossible for him to marshal his boats in sufficient numbers to have any impact whenever the invasion broke. And the U-boats were under unrelenting attack wherever they appeared. Many thought that Doenitz was sending these crews on suicide missions, as the likelihood that they would not return was fast approaching 100%. He was by this time, however, a convinced adherent of Hitler's, as his call to the U-boat crews for increased determination in the execution of their duties proves. Given the enormous Allied presence in the air and at sea, this was tantamount to a call to die. In June 1944, the U-boats were told that the Allied invasion fleet was underway. 2 groups were formed. Landwehr Group was assigned to the English Channel, 49 Type 7C boats from Saint-Nazaire and Brest in France. 4 U-boats were sunk in the first days of the invasion, and only U-162 managed to sink a landing craft before being engulfed with Allied escorts. When the U-boats were sent against the Allies again, 3 boats were lost without one success to record. In August, the Atlantic ports were lost to the Allies, so the boats had to redeploy to bases in Germany and Norway. With the Allied presence overwhelming, it became simply a deadly game of how many boats could stay afloat for how long. U-boat activity shrank to the area around Britain, where in the final 4 months of 1944, 24 Allied ships were lost. The U-boat fleet lost 55. Since the invasion, 25% of the fleet had gone down, 112 boats. Despite the British and American bombers smashing the production sites in Germany, in early 1945 there were 90 of the new Type 21 boats operational and 40 of the Type 23. These electric boats, as they were called, were much faster underwater and therefore difficult to catch. With lethal torpedoes, new radar and anti-sonar coating, they were seen as the last chance to influence events. The Allies were extremely concerned about them. Adalbert Schnee gave a vicious warning about the effectiveness of the new boats. He was given command on U-2511, a Type 21, in February, and soon had sunk 10 ships. The Allied advance on land was marked by an increase in the number of boats that Doenitz put to sea. It was sufficient, he decided, that the boats would tie up substantial numbers of Allied planes and ships. Ignoring the terrible inevitability of the invasion, it was clear to the commanders facing it on land. Perhaps Doenitz still believed Hitler, who was convinced that the new V-1 and V-2 rockets were the wonder weapons that would turn the tide. Whilst the advance of the British and Americans meant that the U-boat construction and repair yards had to be evacuated, the advance of the Russians forced Doenitz to relocate his headquarters from Berlin to Kiel on April the 25th. The Third Reich was now being crushed all over Europe, and tensions between the Allies were becoming more marked. Stalin wanted Poland under his control. Churchill wanted to save Berlin from Stalin and Germany from the Russians' demand for $10 billion reparations. Roosevelt didn't want to save Berlin from the Russians, and Stalin wanted France's role in post-war Europe limited. They had let the Germans in, according to his viewpoint. Hitler's problems were more pressing. He was the only person in Germany who did not know that the war was lost, and his mental degeneration increased his fits of rage and paranoia. Doenitz, as a member of the elite hierarchy surrounding Hitler, must have known too, but he continued to send the boats on missions that became more and more like suicide missions. On the 30th of April, Doenitz gave this broadcast. "The Führer has appointed me to be his successor. Fully aware of the responsibility, I assume leadership of the German people at this fateful hour. My first task is to save Germany from destruction by the advancing Bolshevist enemy. The military struggle continues so as to achieve this goal."
Towards the end of the war, as the resources of the Kriegsmarine began to dwindle, Doenitz ordered his men, 7,000 sailors, to go and try and defend Berlin. He was instrumental in protracting the war for as long as he possibly could in order to try and keep the Nazi regime alive.
Doenitz already knew in 1943 that the war for the Atlantic, and therefore the entire war effort, was probably lost. He still radioed to his men that the German nation was looking to them as the most decisive weapon left to the country. The success or failure of the war depended on the battle for the Atlantic, he told them. He was right. But on the 24th of May, he ordered that the U-boats leave the North Atlantic for the Azores without telling his commanders that the Atlantic War was effectively over. Britain, with the help of her ally America, had won through. When Doenitz addressed the German people after Hitler's death, he spoke of the sacrifice of those who had died and the difficult path that he hoped would lead to a free and secure existence in a peaceful Europe. But Doenitz never blamed his or Germany's actions for the misery of the past or the present.
Any country needs a government. Even though the war had ended, there was still a requirement to govern a country. And as such, the Chancellor, the new Chancellor, was Karl Doenitz, the Flensburg government, which actually presided over Germany until the end of May 1945. It's a strange little coda to the history of the Second World War, but it's something that's interesting to think. Actually, there were two Führers.
Between 20th November 1945 and the 1st of October 1946, the International Military Tribunal tried 21 of the most important surviving leaders of Nazi Germany. The tribunal focused on the crime of aggression. The trials exacted justice against high-ranking Nazi military leaders like Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm Keitel, Hermann Göring, Erich Raeder, and of course, Karl Doenitz. Many of these Nazi leaders were hung for their crimes. Doenitz, however, was not among them.
He was put on trial at Nuremberg for conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, for planning, initiating and waging wars of aggression, and for crimes against the laws of war. Otto Kranzbühler, who had been a judge advocate for the German Navy and imprisoned by the Allies himself for 4 weeks, defended him. Doenitz had specifically requested Kranzbühler as his defense counsel. Kranzbühler, a brilliant and intelligent lawyer, made his appearance in full naval uniform to indicate that the Navy was defending the Grand Admiral. He argued that his client should be accorded the respect he deserved and addressed as Grand Admiral. The chief prosecutor did not bow to this demand. Kranzbühler also considered that the indictments against Doenitz were not valid. Kranzbühler's clear, logical presentation, brilliant rhetorical skills and detailed legal knowledge impressed even his opponents. Doenitz was not accused of crimes against humanity and felt that he was being tried so that the U-boat war would be held to be an act of piracy and justify his removal as head of state. Uncaring of his own fate, he very much wanted to avoid his U-boat men from being tarnished in this way.
Please state your full name.
Karl Doenitz.
Will you repeat this oath after me? I swear by God.
Ich schwöre bei Gott,
the Almighty and Omniscient,
dem Allmächtigen und Allwissenden,
that I will speak the pure truth,
dass ich die reine Wahrheit sage
and will withhold and add nothing,
und nichts verschweigen.
The court process turned into a farce. With exceptional skill, Kranzbühler forced US Admiral Chester Nimitz into court to admit that the USA had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. It was impossible for the Allies to convict their own admiral, or therefore Doenitz.
He rose through the ranks to become an admiral, and in consequence of that, he stood trial for his acquiescence in some of the outrageous acts against humanity and against peace which were committed by the Kriegsmarine. Remarkably, Doenitz wasn't sentenced to hang like Keitel and Jodl. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment and eventually released and able to live a normal life, which is quite extraordinary considering the factors which shaped his life and how much misery and destruction on an illegal basis that he brought to the world.
Nevertheless, during World War II, Germany's shipyards built 1,156 U-boats. They sank a total of 3,500 Allied merchant ships, amounting to 14.5 million gross tons. They also sank 175 Allied warships. In terms of human casualties, 28,000 German U-boat crew lost their lives, and more than 72,000 Allied naval and merchant seamen died as a result of Doenitz's Wolfpack campaigns. This body count alone is staggering, and, of course, does not include Allied lives lost as a result of the convoys failing to deliver vital supplies of food and ammunition, nor does it account for the German and Allied lives lost during the final assault on Berlin, over which Doenitz presided as Führer. Doenitz was released at the end of his incarceration on the 1st of October 1956, and he retired to the small village of Amühl in Schleswig-Holstein in northwest Germany, where he lived out the rest of his life in relative obscurity. And there he died of a heart attack on Christmas Eve 1980. He was buried in Waldfriedhof Cemetery in Amühl on the 6th of January 1981 without military honours, and service members were not allowed to wear uniforms to the funeral. Doenitz was unrepentant regarding his role in World War II, saying that he had acted at all times out of duty to his nation. He was the last German officer with the rank of Großadmiral, and between 1939 and 1945 was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands. He died having never renounced his personal oath to Adolf Hitler or his dedication to the Nazi regime. And he never accepted his personal accountability for the death and suffering that resulted from the orders he gave. It cannot be denied that Karl Doenitz was a Grand Admiral that perpetuated an illegal war against the free world, unquestionably making him an architect of darkness.